Most people think of Vikings as raiders. Long ships, axes, burning monasteries, savage warriors from a brutal past. But for the people actually living there, daily life was not defined by violence. It was defined by money, or more precisely, by the pursuit of it. The world where the historical Vikings emerged was shaped by one of the most sophisticated trade networks the medieval period had ever seen. Welcome to Finance History, one where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. At the beginning of the Viking Age, around 793, Scandinavia sat on the periphery of European wealth, geographically isolated, resource-limited, and economically marginalized. The Frankish Empire controlled the continent's richest lands. The Byzantine Empire controlled the Mediterranean trade. The Islamic caliphates controlled the eastern routes. Scandinavia had forests, fish, and iron. This mattered because Scandinavia was not poor by accident. It was structurally excluded. Most people lived off subsistence farming, not estates in the modern sense. Plots just large enough to survive harsh winters. A bad harvest didn't mean lower profits. It meant starvation, and the rest of Europe didn't care. Scandinavian society was organized around clans and chieftains. Local jarls ruled with the consent of free farmers. After Christianization began, kings started consolidating power. Their job wasn't to improve living standards. It was to maintain honor and ensure loyalty through redistribution of wealth. Silver was the system's backbone, and this is where things get uncomfortable. People today think of wealth as something earned through labor, investment, or trade. In early medieval Scandinavia, wealth was taken because opportunities were limited. Land was finite. Agricultural yields were low. Population pressure was rising. Inheritance customs divided property among all sons, fragmenting holdings across generations. If you were a younger son with no land and no prospects, you had three choices: serve another man, migrate, or take what others had accumulated. There was no social mobility. There was no banking system. There was only force and reputation. Raiding wasn't a cultural preference. It was an economic response. And unlike modern wealth extraction, it had no legal frameworks, no taxation authorities, no regulation. Violence wasn't a flaw. It was the business model. If you couldn't inherit wealth, you sailed for it. The technology made it possible. Longships were engineering marvels: shallow draft, symmetrical bow and stern, light enough to portage, fast enough to escape pursuit. They could navigate open ocean and slide up rivers into the heart of continental Europe. Monasteries sat along rivers, undefended, filled with accumulated donations, silver candlesticks, golden reliquaries, coin hoards. From a Viking perspective, these are warehouses, not sacred spaces, warehouses filled with portable, divisible wealth guarded by unarmed men who wouldn't resist. The moral framework didn't matter. The economic logic did. Here's how it usually worked. A group of young men pools resources. They build or acquire ship. They sail to England, Ireland, or Francia. They target a monastery, estate, or coastal town. They take silver, slaves, and anything valuable. They return before winter. The wealth is divided. Reputation grows. Success attracts more men for the next voyage. This wasn't random violence. It was coordinated, strategic, and profitable. And over time, raiding became systematized. Fleets grew larger. Targets became more ambitious. Instead of hit-and-run attacks, Vikings began overwintering in fortified camps. They demanded tribute to leave. Danegeld, the protection payment English kingdoms offered, formalized raiding into a tax system. Vikings didn't conquer territory to settle it initially. They conquered it to extract from it. Payment in silver became preferable to fighting. Why risk men when rulers would pay you to go away? This is the world Vikings operated in. And it's important to say this clearly. Most Vikings were not raiders because they were inherently violent or morally deficient. They were raiders because the system offered limited alternatives. Scandinavia needed wealth. Continental Europe had concentrated it. Naval technology provided access. Risk provided return. All of that pressure sat on young men with the least margin for inheritance. This produced something else as well. Competition. Scandinavia was not unified. It was fragmented. Chieftains competed for followers. Followers competed for shares of plunder. Success in raiding translated into political power at home. Silver bought loyalty. Loyalty enabled larger raids. Larger raids produced more silver. It was a feedback loop that transformed Scandinavian society from the bottom up. And this is where modern viewers often miss the point. When Vikings brought back silver, they weren't hoarding it in isolation. They were redistributing it. Chieftains held feasts. They gave gifts. They paid retainers. The wealth flowed through social networks, creating obligations, alliances, and hierarchies. Economic success wasn't just personal enrichment. It was the foundation of political authority. Words like generosity in this context didn't just mean kindness. They meant redistribution, loyalty, power. And power required constant replenishment. The raiding economy was designed to be expansive, not sustainable. It extracted wealth externally with remarkable efficiency. It tolerated risk as long as returns justified it. Plunder mattered more than stability. Growth mattered more than peace. This is why Scandinavia felt dynamic. Men sailed further and returned wealthier. Success didn't translate into long-term security. It translated into status. And status required continuous proof. The economy functioned, but it didn't settle. And importantly, everyone knew it. There was no illusion that raiding could last forever. There was no belief that violence guaranteed survival. There was only ambition and competition and awareness that the system required constant expansion. That awareness is where strategy becomes necessary. Because when an economy depends on external extraction, even small resistance changes the calculation. Even fortifications can redirect it, especially fortifications. By the mid-9th century, the raiding model begins hitting limits. The targets Vikings relied on were adapting. Monasteries built walls. Coastal towns constructed defenses. Kingdoms organized standing armies. Frankish rulers fortified river access points with bridges and garrisons. English kings like Alfred created the systems, networks of fortified towns that made quick raids harder to execute. The returns on raiding started diminishing. More risk, less silver, stronger resistance. And Vikings, being pragmatic, responded not with escalation alone, but with evolution. If raiding was becoming less profitable, trade became more attractive. To understand why Vikings shifted toward commerce, you have to look at the networks they had already established. Most people today imagine Vikings as arriving in foreign lands without preparation, attacking randomly, and leaving. But in economic terms, Vikings had been building intelligence and relationships for decades. They knew which regions were wealthy, which rivers were navigable, which rulers were weak. That knowledge didn't just enable raiding. It enabled trade. Scandinavia had resources other regions wanted. Furs, walrus, ivory, amber, timber, iron. The Islamic world paid in silver for these northern goods. Byzantium wanted Scandinavian mercenaries and slaves. Western Europe needed raw materials its own lands couldn't provide. Vikings controlled the routes between these markets. They weren't just middlemen. They were the infrastructure. Trading posts emerged across the Viking world. Berke in Sweden, Hedeby in Denmark, Koppang in Norway, Dublin in Ireland, York in England. These weren't just villages. They were commercial hubs where silver, slaves, furs, weapons, jewelry, and textiles moved between distant economies. Merchants replaced raiders in some regions that in others. The same men did both. The line between commerce and coercion remained thin, but the economic logic shifted. Repeat transactions became more valuable than one-time plunder. Reputation for fair dealing mattered in trade networks. Violence undermined future business. This created a quiet transformation. Viking society started rewarding different skills. Navigation still mattered, but now for locating trade winds, not just targets. Language skills became valuable. Credit relationships formed. Traders extended goods on trust, expecting payment later. Debt instruments appeared. Silver was weighed, not just taken. Standards emerged. The transition wasn't complete. Raiding continued, but increasingly, it became a secondary strategy. Trade was more predictable, less risky, and over time, more profitable. And people noticed. By the 10th century, Viking merchants were operating across 4 continents. They traded in Baghdad, Constantinople, Kiev, and London. They weren't arriving as enemies. They were arriving as partners. This matters because Vikings didn't abandon their economic model. They expanded it. When raiding became costly, they innovated. When resistance hardened, they negotiated. When trade proved lucrative, they institutionalized it. And when they needed legitimacy, they adapted culturally. That's why the transition carried weight. But trade alone doesn't replace an entire social system. Settlement does. Vikings didn't just move silver. They moved people. And those people didn't just raid or trade. They stayed. They farmed. They married. They integrated. And when they did, something unexpected happened. They stopped being Vikings. Instead, they became Normans in France, Rus in Eastern Europe, settlers in England, Iceland, and Greenland. The economic pressure that drove raiding, limited land, fragmented inheritance, no other opportunities, was resolved not through conquest but through colonization. New land meant new resources. It meant inheritance for younger sons. It meant stability without depending on external plunder. This is why settlement mattered more than people realize. It wasn't just territorial expansion. It was economic release. The pressure valve that had driven centuries of raiding was redirected into agriculture, governance, and integration. Vikings who settled in England became English. Vikings who settled in Normandy became French. Within 2 generations, their descendants spoke local languages, adopted local customs, and defended the very territories their ancestors had raided. The transformation was profound and disorienting. What had been a culture defined by mobility became rooted. What had been defined by extraction became productive. And the institutions that emerged reflected this shift. Kings replaced chieftains. Law codes replaced personal oaths. Christian conversion formalized political alliances. Taxation replaced plunder as the revenue model. Trade agreements replaced raids as the method of wealth transfer. This crossed a threshold. Scandinavia tolerated decentralization when wealth came externally. It required centralization when wealth had to be generated internally. And consolidation required legitimacy. Chieftains ruled through reputation. Kings ruled through institutions. The shift wasn't primarily cultural. It was economic and structural. The raiding economy could tolerate fragmentation. The trade and settlement economy required coordination, law, and stability. What raiding couldn't provide, commerce demanded. Because once people stop accepting violence as the primary wealth mechanism, systems need alternatives to enforce obligations. By the 11th century, the Viking Age was effectively over. Not because Vikings were defeated, but because the conditions that created them had changed. Scandinavia was integrated into European trade networks. Its rulers were Christian kings recognized by continental powers. Its people were farmers, merchants, and subjects, not raiders. The economic pressure that drove expansion had dissipated. Land was available through settlement. Wealth was available through trade. Status was available through service to centralized authorities. The old model didn't collapse. It was absorbed. What followed wasn't the end of Scandinavian influence. It was the transformation of it. Normans conquered England in 1066, creating one of medieval Europe's most powerful kingdoms. Rus Vikings founded states that became Russia and Ukraine. Icelandic settlers created one of the world's earliest parliamentary systems. The descendants of raiders became the architects of medieval state formation. And then the narrative shifted. By the 12th century, Europeans didn't remember Vikings as traders or settlers. They remembered them as barbarians. The violence was emphasized. The commerce was forgotten. The complexity was erased. This serves a purpose. It allows settled societies to distance themselves from their own origins. It makes raiding seem like barbarism rather than economic strategy. It obscures the fact that many medieval kingdoms were built on the same extraction logic Vikings perfected. By framing Vikings as uniquely violent, Europe avoided confronting how similar their own systems were. Taxation replaced raiding, but extraction continued. Feudalism concentrated land just as effectively as plunder had. The moral language changed, but the material dynamics remained. Vikings had not been operating outside economic logic. They had been responding to it with brutal clarity. And that clarity is what makes their story uncomfortable. Because when you strip away the mythology, Vikings reveal something Europe preferred not to acknowledge. Wealth doesn't care how it's acquired. Power doesn't care how it's justified. And systems built on extraction don't become moral just because they legalize the process. After the Viking Age ended, the networks they built did not vanish. Trade routes persisted. Legal codes influenced governance structures. Cultural exchange continued. The economic revolution Vikings enabled, connecting Northern Europe to global markets, integrating peripheral regions into continental systems, didn't reverse when raiding stopped. It accelerated. Europe became wealthier not despite the Vikings, but partially because of them. The silver they moved, the routes they established, the settlements they created, all contributed to the medieval economic expansion that followed. And over time, something unexpected happened. The societies that had been terrorized by Vikings didn't eliminate their influence. They absorbed it, learned from it, and replicated it. In doing so, they quietly conceded something profound. Economic success matters more than moral consistency. Wealth justifies itself retroactively, and the line between raider and trader is thinner than anyone wants to admit. The Viking economy shows us something uncomfortable. Systems don't transform simply because they are violent. They transform when violence stops being profitable. Vikings optimized extraction through raiding. But when resistance made raiding costly, they shifted to trade. When trade required stability, they settled. When settlement required legitimacy, they converted. The model evolved, but the goal remained: wealth accumulation. And that's the deeper lesson. Economic systems, shaped by opportunity, are extraordinarily adaptable. They survive resistance. They survive moral condemnation. They even survive military defeat. What they don't survive is unprofitability. The moment extraction costs more than it returns, systems change. Not because people become enlightened, but because incentives shift. History doesn't repeat, but it does expose patterns. And once you see how economic pressure drives behavior, not just culture or values, it becomes much harder to believe that modern systems are fundamentally different. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.